In the last video, we looked at how the basic blues progression has evolved to what we would consider a typical jazz blues progression. In this one, we're going to talk about strategies for improvising on a more complex harmonic framework, and as I pointed out, these tips will go beyond improvising on the blues and lay the groundwork for improvising on other kinds of tunes as well. The first change from the basic blues progression is the addition of a 4 chord in the second bar. In talking about the basic blues progression, I emphasized the melodic importance of dropping the major third of the 1 chord a half step to become the flat 7 of the 4 chord. The same thing happens in the jazz blues progression, but it happens in the second bar as well as the 5th bar. The next thing to consider is the addition of a 2 chord in the 4th bar, which creates a 2-5. Now I'm going to talk more about 2-5s in another video, but here's a couple of thoughts about how to begin approaching them. First, you could choose to ignore one of the chords and treat the bar as either a 2 minor chord or a 5 dominant chord. You can do this because both chords are extracted from the same scale or pool of notes. In this case, the F Dorian and the B flat Mixolydian scales both contain the same notes as an E flat major scale. Now if you're going to focus on one chord only, the dominant is the most important because dominant chords set up an expectation of resolution, and that provides forward motion in the chord progression. Now, one way to increase the sense of forward motion into the 5th bar is to avoid playing the dominant 7th of the 1 chord until you get to the 4th bar. To do this, I'm going to think about a 1 major 6 chord on the 1st and 3rd bars. Now this also works well with the 4 chord in the 2nd bar because the major 6 of the 1 chord is the same note as the major 3rd of the 4 chord. You just have to make sure to change that D to a D flat when you're on the 4 chord. Since the 2 chord and the 5 chord are extracted from the same scale, if you want to get the sound of the 2-5, you have to focus on the chord tones, and specifically the chord tones that are different. Here you see the notes of F minor 7 and B flat dominant 7 chords. I've inverted the B flat 7 chord so that it's a little bit easier to see. Both chords contain F and A flat, so those notes will work on either chord, but they won't imply the movement of one chord to the next. So we're going to focus on the notes that are different and the way they move from the 2 chord to the 5 chord. Now I want to point out that this is an important thing to consider when you're improvising on chord changes. Instead of thinking about entire scales for each chord, pay attention to the notes that are different. Those are the notes that define the harmonic change, and that'll bring out the sound of the chord progression in your lines. In this case, we see that the 5th of the 2 chord moves down a whole step to become the root of the 5 chord, and the 7th of the 2 chord moves down a half step to become the 3rd of the 5 chord. The 7-3 movement is really the defining melodic motion in a 2-5, along with the root motion. If playing the root on each chord is the simplest melodic path through a 2-5-1, then 7-3-1 is the second simplest. Most of what we consider 2-5 licks will incorporate the 7-3 movement one way or another. Now we'll look at the second 4 bars of the jazz blues progression, starting with bar 8. This bar is either a 6 dominant chord or a 2-5 based on the 6 dominant. In the last video, I described this bar as the most harmonically deviant, and that's because the major third of a 6 dominant is non-diatonic. It's what I call a pivotal tone, an important chord tone that's outside the key. I'll talk more about pivotal tones in another video, but that note is the defining harmonic element in this bar. Now let's add the 3 chord and look at this bar as a 2-5. The roots of the 2 chords, D and G, are the 3rd and 6th degrees of the key, so we call this bar 3-6. But because it's a 2-5 leading to the 2 chord in the next bar, we can also call it 2-5 of 2. Now I know this can sound confusing. How can one bar be both 3-6 and 2-5? I understand what it is that I'm saying, yet it still sounds confusing to me when I say it out loud, so don't feel too bad. But a good takeaway from this that's easier to grasp is that navigating a set of chord changes is like driving a car. The GPS shows you what street you're on and where you have to turn next, But to really have an understanding of where you're going, you need a zoomed-out map view that gives you the bigger picture. Well, jazz is a lot like that. As you become more familiar with the language, you're able to see the bigger picture. Instead of focusing on individual chords, you start to see how groups of chords work together to take you someplace. For example, the 2 chord and the 5 chord work together to take you to the 1 chord, and the 3 chords together imply an overall key center. So the 8th bar is taking us to the 9th bar. And we need to incorporate the non-diatonic major third of the 6th chord to get the sound of this bar. We'll start by inserting the 7 of the 2 chord and the 3 of the 5 chord on the 2nd and 3rd beats of the bar, so that the melodic movement follows the harmonic movement. Now we sandwich those 2 notes between the roots of the 2 chords. This gives us a simple melodic pattern that clearly follows the contours of the 2/5 by playing root, 7, 3, root. Now another way to see this pattern is 5, 4, 3, 1 based on the dominant chord. So the melodic idea works whether you're thinking of the bar as a 6 dominant chord or as a 2/5. We could also continue the pattern over the next 2 bars using half notes instead of quarter notes. This is a very basic pattern, but it does give the sound of the 2/5 in a way that's easy to conceive, and it's a relatively easy one to practice through all the keys. The next alteration happens in the 6th bar, where a sharp 4 diminished chord might take the place of the 4 dominant chord, either for the whole bar or in the second half of the bar. As I pointed out in the last video, this sounds more complicated than it actually is. The only difference between an E-flat 7 chord and an E diminished chord is the root. So the sound is actually very similar. Now you could play a diminished arpeggio or a scale or a pattern on this chord, but here's another way to think about it. The only note that's different in the diminished chord is the E natural. And that note also exists in the blues scale. So the 6th bar is a great place to jump back on the blues scale, regardless of whether the rhythm section plays a diminished chord or not. In the 9th and 10th bars, we see a 2/5 in the key of the tune, but this time it extends over 2 bars, so we've got a little bit more time to work with each chord. One approach would be to run up the C Dorian scale on the 2 chord and then down the F bebop scale from the 3rd of the 5 chord. Now that clip also provided an example of anticipating a chord change. In the last bar, instead of thinking about the 2/5 that's in that bar, I was thinking ahead and playing something based on and leading to the 1 chord at the start of the next chorus. If we go back to the car analogy, driving instructors teach you to look down the road, not at what's right in front of the car. That gives you more time to react to what's coming up. As an improviser, thinking about where you're going as opposed to where you are right now is a key element in seeing the big picture. Anticipating a chord change both connects and propels your lines. Another thing that can help you see the bigger picture in chord progressions is to find a single scale that works over multiple chords. The 2-5-1 progression is a good example. You can use the notes of a single major scale on all 3 chords. Another example is the blues scale. In the last video, I showed that the blues scale can still be used to improvise over the jazz blues progression, and I told you a story about a student who sounded more like Coltrane when he used the blues scale than when he played his Coltrane licks. But we have talked about some additional note choices in this video, so let's see if there's a single scale that can incorporate all of them. We'll start with the F Mixolydian scale based on the 5 chord, which contains the same notes as the B-flat major scale. To that scale, we're going to add the major 7 passing tone in the bebop scale. I think I talked about that in the second video in this series. Now we'll add the flat 3rd and the flat 7 from the B-flat blues scale. Finally, we'll add the major 3rd from the 6th dominant chord, which lies between the 1st and 2nd degrees of the B-flat major scale. Now at this point, we've got 11 of the 12 possible notes of the chromatic scale, so we may as well go ahead and add in the remaining note as a passing tone between 5 and 6. So we've wound up with the full chromatic scale, which on one level is not particularly helpful. But let's look at it like this. All 12 notes are available at all times. You can find a way to make any note work on any chord. But depending on the chord, certain notes are going to shine a bit brighter, like light shining through a mist. Now some people might refer to those as the good notes or the pretty notes. They're the ones that illuminate and guide you through the chord progression. Emphasizing those notes in the context of a melodic line is the art of improvising over chord changes.